What if I told you 3 words erased a $2.8 trillion demand without a single threat, sanction, or negotiation? That's not a headline from a movie. That's what actually happened. A former US president publicly demanded $2.8 trillion. From Canada, a number so large it's bigger than the GDP of most countries on Earth. No spreadsheet, no evidence, just a number dropped like a bomb. And the world watched, stunned, waiting for Canada's response. What came next wasn't anger, it wasn't defiance, it wasn't even a speech. It was 3 calm words that exposed something far more dangerous than a bad deal. Those words didn't just embarrass a politician, they challenged the credibility of American power itself. Within hours, global markets, diplomats, and economists were paying attention because this wasn't about money, it was about competence, trust, and whether global leadership still belongs to those who shout the loudest or those who can actually prove what they claim. Stay with me. Because once you see what those 3 words revealed, you'll never look at power the same way again. If this video made you pause, rethink, or question what real leadership looks like, tell us your take in the comments. Not just agree or disagree, but what you think this moment really says about global power. We put serious research, time, and effort into breaking these stories down so they actually make sense. No noise, no fluff, just clarity. So if you value that kind of content, subscribe to the channel. It's literally 1 click, and it helps us keep making videos that challenge the story you're usually told. For decades, political power worked like this. If a powerful country said something loudly enough, others adjusted. Numbers didn't always need proof because authority filled the gaps. That's exactly what made the $2.8 trillion demand so revealing. It wasn't presented as a proposal or even a negotiation. It was presented as a fact, as if repeating it made it real. And in political theater, that approach often works until someone refuses to play along. When Donald Trump demanded compensation, he was speaking the language of assertion. Big number, big confidence, big threat. But Mark Carney responded in the language of reality. Show Your Work did something devastatingly simple. It shifted the conversation from emotion to evidence, from dominance to documentation. Suddenly, this wasn't about who had more power. It was about who could actually prove their claim. That shift matters because economics doesn't reward confidence, it rewards accuracy. In math, you don't get credit for sounding sure. You get credit for showing how you arrived at the answer. By forcing the issue on the numbers, Carney removed every escape route. No rhetoric, no patriotism, no intimidation, just a basic question every student learns early in school: how did you get that number? And when no answer came, the silence was louder than any rebuttal. This is why those 3 words landed so hard. They didn't attack a person, they exposed a process failure. And once political power is forced onto factual ground it can't defend, the illusion of strength collapses instantly. That's not a rhetorical loss, that's a structural one. If this breakdown made something click for you, don't just scroll, leave a comment explaining what stood out most or where you think power really comes from today. We put serious time, research, and effort into making complex stories clear and honest because you deserve more than headlines. So if you value that depth, subscribe to the channel. It's 1 click, and it helps us keep doing this work the right way. The most dangerous part of the $2.8 trillion demand wasn't the size of the number, it was the absence behind it. In serious economic systems, big claims are built on models, data, assumptions, and limits. They come with footnotes, caveats, and revisions. But when Canada asked a basic follow-up, how was this calculated? The response from Washington wasn't clarification, it was deflection. Reviews were ongoing. Methods were classified, calculations were proprietary, different agencies gave different answers, all pointing nowhere. That's when the illusion collapsed. Because if the number had been real, the evidence would already exist. You don't invent a $2.8 trillion figure first and do the math later. That reversal revealed what this actually was. Political theater dressed up as economic policy. The goal wasn't toll accuracy, the goal was intimidation. Sound authoritative, move fast, and never stop long enough for anyone to check the math. That approach can work on domestic audiences, but it fails instantly when dealing with professionals who live inside data for a living. This is why Mark Carney didn't argue details. He didn't counter with a different number. He understood that debating a fantasy only gives it legitimacy. Instead, he exposed the process failure itself. By demanding evidence, he revealed that there was none, and that revelation mattered far more than any counterclaim. Once partners see that your numbers are performative, not analytical, they stop negotiating and start protecting themselves. And that's how influence erodes, not with a bang, but with quiet disbelief. If this made you realize how often big claims hide empty foundations, tell us in the comments, what moment exposed that truth for you? We put real effort and research into breaking down power without the spin, because understanding matters more than outrage. If you appreciate that, subscribe to the channel. It's one click, and it helps us keep making content that actually respects your intelligence. What made this moment truly unsettling wasn't the bad math. It was what the bad math signaled. For most of the modern era, American power didn't come only from market size or military strength. It came from institutions that were trusted to do the work, economists who ran models, agencies that argued internally, and professionals whose job was to tell leaders when their numbers didn't add up. That institutional discipline is what made U.S. demands credible, even when they were controversial. And this episode showed how far that discipline has eroded. When Donald Trump made the demand, no serious institutional process stood behind it. No unified analysis, no coherent explanation, no agency willing to publicly defend the figure with evidence. That absence wasn't accidental. It was structural. Political performance had replaced professional constraint. And once institutions stop acting as guardrails, leaders stop being corrected before embarrassing themselves on the world stage. That's how you end up with numbers that sound powerful but collapse under the lightest scrutiny. By contrast, Mark Carney represented the opposite model of power. His confidence didn't come from personality or volume. It came from knowing that the institutions behind him had done the work. When he said, "Show your work," he wasn't gambling. He knew Canada's position was documented, defensible, and boring in the best possible way. And that contrast is what global audiences noticed. One side spoke with certainty, but no backing. The other spoke calmly because it didn't need to bluff. This is why the moment went viral, far beyond politics. People weren't just reacting to a clever line. They were witnessing a competence gap. And in the modern world, competence is power. Markets trust it. Allies rely on it, partners plan around it. When institutions weaken, even the strongest countries start sounding hollow. And once that perception sets in, it's incredibly hard to reverse. If this made you think differently about where real power actually comes from, drop a comment with the moment that changed your perspective. We put serious time, research, and care into every video to go deeper than headlines and noise. If that matters to you, subscribe to the channel. It's just one click, and it helps us keep doing this work the right way. Powerful countries usually control negotiations by choosing the battlefield. Sometimes it's tariffs, sometimes security, sometimes access to markets. What made this moment different is that the battlefield shifted instantly and not in America's favor. When the demand was issued, the assumption was clear: the conversation would stay political, emotional, and asymmetrical. Big country versus smaller neighbor. Pressure versus compliance. But with 3 words, the terrain changed from politics to proof. And that single shift neutralized almost every traditional advantage. When Mark Carney said, "Show your work," he wasn't engaging on America's chosen ground. He was dragging the conversation into a space governed by rules, documentation, and verification. And that space doesn't care about threats or confidence. It rewards preparation. It rewards boring competence. Most importantly, it exposes weakness instantly. Once the discussion became about numbers instead of narratives, there was nowhere to hide. No rally applause, no media spin, just an empty space where evidence should have been. This matters because Donald Trump has always relied on controlling the frame. Loud claims, rapid escalation. Keep moving so no one can slow things down enough to fact check. Carney did the opposite. He slowed everything down. He forced a pause, and in that pause, the imbalance flipped. Canada didn't need to overpower the United States. It only needed to out-prepare it. The more time passed without documentation, the weaker the original demand became. This is why serious countries obsess over process. You don't win every negotiation by being stronger. You win by making sure the rules favor you. Once the rules were evidence-based, Canada had the advantage. And once the US accepted that frame, whether it wanted to or not, the outcome was inevitable. Control the terrain and you control the outcome. Lose it, and even the strongest actor starts to look exposed. If this made you rethink how power is really exercised, leave a comment explaining where you think the US lost control of the conversation. We invest real time and research into unpacking moments like this so you get clarity, not noise. If that effort matters to you, subscribe to the channel. It's one click, and it keeps this work possible. The viral moment didn't stay between Washington and Ottawa for long, because it was never really about Canada. It was about what the rest of the world learned by watching it unfold. For decades, many countries assumed that when the United States made a claim, there was serious analysis somewhere behind it, even if they disagreed with the conclusion. That assumption acted like invisible glue holding together alliances, markets, and negotiations. What happened here quietly dissolved that glue, and everyone noticed. When Mark Carney asked for evidence and none appeared, global audiences didn't see a trade dispute. They saw a credibility test fail in real time. Allies don't need America to be perfect, but they do need it to be predictable and competent. The absence of proof sent a message far beyond Canada. If this claim wasn't real, how many others are built the same way? That question doesn't get asked publicly very often, but once it enters the room, it never really leaves. This is where the long-term damage happens. Countries don't confront weakened credibility head-on. They adjust quietly, they hedge risk, they diversify suppliers, they demand third-party verification. They stop taking statements at face value and start demanding paperwork before committing capital or policy. And that shift has real consequences. Markets price uncertainty. Investors avoid unpredictability. Diplomatic leverage erodes when partners no longer assume competence by default. What makes this so striking is that Donald Trump didn't lose influence because the US suddenly became smaller or poorer. He lost influence because credibility became questionable in the modern world. Size opens doors, but credibility determines whether people stay in the room. Carney's response didn't attack American power. It revealed that power without proof now travels much less far than it used. And once the world internalizes that lesson, it reshapes behavior in ways no headline can fully capture. If this made you realize how quiet signals shape global power, drop a comment with the country or moment that changed how you see US leadership. We put real effort, research, and care into every video to go deeper than surface-level outrage. If that work adds value for you, subscribe to the channel. It's one click, and it helps us keep doing this the right way. One of the biggest misunderstandings about global power is the belief that countries respond to weakness with public defiance. They usually don't. Serious governments avoid drama. They avoid headlines. Instead, they hedge quietly, methodically, and permanently. What made this moment so consequential is that Mark Carney didn't escalate the conflict. He gave other countries permission to do what they were already considering. Stop taking American claims at face value and start protecting themselves. When the demand collapsed under basic scrutiny, it sent a clear signal to allies and partners watching closely. If the United States could not document a massive claim against its closest and most cooperative trading partner, then no country could assume future U.S. demands would be analytically grounded. That realization doesn't lead to angry press conferences. It leads to contingency planning. Governments begin diversifying supply chains, investors reduce exposure, negotiators insist on third-party arbitration. None of this looks dramatic, but all of it weakens leverage over time. This is where the damage becomes structural. When trust erodes, partners don't fight you, they work around you. And that's far more costly than a loud dispute. Markets become cautious. Long-term agreements shrink. Strategic dependence turns into strategic distance. The irony is that these shifts are often invisible to domestic audiences, which creates a dangerous feedback loop. Leaders believe their approach is working because there's no immediate backlash, while the real consequences quietly compound beneath the surface. What makes this especially revealing is that Donald Trump didn't just fail to extract concessions, he accelerated this hedging behavior by forcing the issue without evidence. He made unpredictability the central feature of American economics, policy, and in a global system built on planning and forecasts, unpredictability is a liability. Carney's response didn't weaken the United States through confrontation. It did something far more effective. It exposed uncertainty, and uncertainty drives rational actors to de-risk. That's how influence fades, not with resistance, but with quiet withdrawal. If this made you realize how power erodes quietly, not loudly, tell us in the comments what signal you think the world took from this moment. We put serious research and effort into uncovering what headlines miss and explaining why it matters. If you value that depth, subscribe to the channel. It's one click and it helps us keep doing this work properly. For a long time, strength in global politics was measured by how hard you could push. Bigger economy, bigger threats, bigger numbers. And for decades, that worked because most partners assumed that behind the pressure there was still serious thinking. What made this moment different is that it shattered that assumption. When Mark Carney calmly asked for evidence, he wasn't just responding to a claim. He was quietly redefining what real strength looks like in the modern world. In today's interconnected economy, strength isn't about who can shout the loudest or demand the most. It's about who can be trusted to be right. Supply chains, financial markets, and long-term investments depend on predictability. They depend on systems that behave logically, not emotionally. When Donald Trump framed strength as dominance, issuing an enormous demand without proof, he was using a 20th century definition of power in a 21st century system that no longer rewards it. Carney's response flipped that logic on its head. He showed that strength today is the ability to withstand scrutiny without panic, to invite questions instead of avoiding them, to slow things down instead of escalating. That kind of confidence doesn't come from bravado, it comes from preparation. And that's why the moment resonated so widely. Viewers around the world instinctively recognized which posture felt more and credible, the one demanding obedience, or the one comfortable enough to ask for verification. This shift matters because global influence now flows toward actors who can anchor stability in an unstable world. Countries don't want partners who are aggressive. They want partners who are reliable. And reliability comes from institutions that value accuracy over optics. By doing nothing more than asking for proof, Carney demonstrated a form of power that doesn't need to announce itself. And in the modern era, that quiet confidence often carries more weight than any threat ever could. If this made you rethink what strength actually looks like today, share your perspective in the comments. What kind of leadership do you trust most? We put real-time research and care into making these videos thoughtful, not reactive. If that matters to you, subscribe to the channel. It's one click and it helps us keep raising the bar. One of the most powerful aspects of this moment is what didn't happen. There was no insult, no moral lecture, no anti-American rhetoric. And that's exactly why it worked. When Mark Carney said, "Show your work," he didn't criticize the United States. He let the absence of evidence speak for itself. That distinction matters because countries can dismiss attacks, but they can easily dismiss silence where proof should be. By refusing to escalate emotionally, Carney avoided triggering the usual defensive reflex. There was no enemy to rally against, no outrage to exploit. Instead, the focus stayed exactly where it was: most uncomfortable institutional competence. The weakness exposed wasn't American ambition or influence, it was American process. And process is hard to spin. You either have the analysis or you don't. Once that gap became visible, global audiences didn't need commentary to understand what they were seeing. This is why the moment was so damaging without being confrontational. Allies could absorb the lesson without appearing disloyal. Markets could adjust without panic. Partners could rethink assumptions without issuing statements. The weakness became a shared observation rather than a public accusation. And that kind of exposure is far more enduring than a heated dispute. It reshapes expectations quietly, which is how long-term influence actually changes. What makes this especially consequential is that Donald Trump couldn't counter the message without making things worse. Any attempt to escalate would only reinforce the perception of avoidance. Any attempt to explain would invite more questions. Carney had created a trap, not through aggression, but through restraint. By staying factual and calm, he forced American leadership into a position where silence looked like incapacity. And once weakness is visible without being named, it becomes almost impossible to deny. If this made you notice how quiet moments can be more powerful than loud ones, share your thoughts in the comments. What details stood out most to you? We put real effort and care into unpacking moments that others rushed past. If you appreciate that depth, subscribe to the channel. It's one click, and it helps us keep doing this work properly. Most viral moments burn bright and disappear. They trend, they entertain, and then they're forgotten. What made this moment different is that it didn't fade, it stuck. When Mark Carney said, "Show your work," it wasn't just a clever line for social media, it became a standard, a benchmark, a simple test that other countries, analysts, and institutions could now apply to future American claims. And once a standard exists, it changes behavior long after the headlines move on. From that point forward, the question wasn't, is the US right? It became, can the US prove it? That's a subtle but powerful shift. Credibility used to be assumed and challenged only in extreme cases. Now it has to be demonstrated repeatedly. Every demand, every threat, every negotiation carries an invisible follow-up question. Where's the evidence? That's not hostility, it's caution. And caution spreads fast in global systems built on trust. This is where the long-term impact really lives. A credibility test doesn't need to be failed loudly to matter, it just needs to exist. Once partners internalize that American claims might not be backed by rigorous analysis, they adapt. They slow negotiations, they add safeguards, they reduce exposure. None of this shows up as confrontation, but all of it reduces influence. The power that once flowed automatically now has to be earned transaction by transaction. The irony is that Donald Trump helped create this test himself. By making an extraordinary demand without extraordinary proof, he invited scrutiny that never fully goes away. Carney didn't need to win an argument. He only needed to ask the right question once, and that question now lingers over every future claim. In global politics, That's far more damaging than losing a single negotiation. It turns authority into something conditional. And conditional authority is the beginning of decline. If this made you think about how one moment can change expectations forever, tell us in the comments what test you think leaders should always have to pass. We put serious effort and research into making sense of these turning points, not just reacting to them. If that kind of analysis matters to you, subscribe to the channel. It's one click, and it helps us keep raising the standard. The final and most important reason this moment mattered is that it shattered one of the oldest assumptions in global politics, that leadership comes automatically with size and history. For decades, the United States didn't always need to justify itself because its leadership was presumed. Markets assumed competence. Allies assumed preparation. Partners assumed there was serious work happening behind closed doors. What happened here showed that those assumptions are no longer guaranteed. And once leadership has to be earned again, the entire global balance subtly shifts. When Mark Carney asked for evidence, he wasn't challenging America's past leadership. He was questioning its present credibility. That distinction is crucial. The world still recognizes American capacity, innovation, and scale. What it's increasingly unsure about is whether American decision-making is anchored in the kind of disciplined analysis that leadership requires. And leadership without discipline doesn't inspire confidence. It creates risk. This is why the moment landed so hard with serious observers. It confirmed a growing suspicion that authority is no longer being reinforced by institutions, but replaced by performance. When Donald Trump made an enormous claim without defensible backing, it wasn't just a political misstep. It was a signal that the internal checks that once protected American credibility are weakening. And when those checks weaken, partners stop following automatically. They start evaluating, comparing, choosing alternatives. That's the real danger here. Not embarrassment, not a bad headline, but the slow normalization of doubt. Leadership in the modern world doesn't come from being the biggest voice in the room. It comes from being the most reliable. One, from doing the work even when no one is watching. Carney's 3 words mattered because they reminded the world of that standard. And they raised an uncomfortable question. If leadership now has to be proven, who is still willing to do what that proof requires? If this final point made you rethink what leadership really means today, leave a comment with the one quality you think global leaders can't afford to lose. We put real-time research and care into every video so these moments actually make sense, not just noise. If that matters to you, subscribe to the channel. It's one click, and it helps us keep doing this work the right way.